Hey everyone. So as a lot of you know, I recently ran my first ever marathon. I've been running for like 4 years off and on. I've done a couple of half marathons. And truthfully, I never thought that I would actually do a full marathon. But I did. I ran earlier this year. I ran 16 miles one night, and I just decided then and there that okay, you know what? If I can do 16, if I've got several months, I can train up, and I will do this marathon. And so I did. I signed up for a race that happened a couple of weeks ago, and it ended up being quite the experience as any marathon would. But this, even against my pretty heavy expectations, was pretty wild. So I had a lot of people ask, so I'm gonna go ahead and just walk everyone through what happened. So I signed up for what was called the Mellow Trail Race out here, just outside of Austin, Texas, and part of the reason I did this is like the half marathons I've done, they're big, there's thousands of people, and all that. And the energy's good, but I think I wasn't certain that I could do 26.2 miles, which is what a full marathon is. So I decided I wanted to do something that was a little more low key. And so I took the Mellow Trail Race name a little literally. I do a lot of trail running for training out here in Austin around Lady Bird Lake and some of these other areas. So, I figured, okay, yeah, running on dirt, I'm used to that, whatever. And turned out that's not at all what it was. We'll get to that in a minute. But yeah, so, leading up to the marathon itself, I'd been training for months and following a program and focusing a lot more on my diet and being careful, cross training. I really took it very seriously. Problem is, about a week and a half into the full 12-week training program I was doing, I got a pretty bad calf strain. And so I had to take like a week off in the beginning, and then I was kind of training through that strain through most of it. And it got really bad again toward the last few weeks of training. So my last couple of weeks, I was hardly running at all. And I know you're supposed to taper, but I really, really was undertrained heading into the race. And so, my calf was still acting up, and I wasn't sure how it was going to go. So, I was going to at least try to do it. So the race, as these things often do, it started very early in the morning, and it was about an hour from my house. So I got up, ended up running behind as you always do, and gathered up. I have my running belt full of when you run a race that long, you need a lot of supplies. You need like gels to keep your carbohydrates and things. You have glycogen stores that will run out as you run a long period of time, and so you have to fuel throughout the race to prevent those glycogen stores from totally depleting. Usually around mile 18, a lot of runners hit what they call the wall, and the idea is to prevent that from happening as long as possible. And so anyway, so this race is at this big park, lakeside in Austin, Texas, beautiful place. And they had at most marathons and races, they have these things called aid stations set up along the way to help you, get water, fuel as you go. At a bigger race than some of the ones I've been to, these are usually every couple of miles. Well, the Mellow Trail Race was a smaller race, so there were 5 along the loop. And the way the marathon worked is you did the same 13.1 mile loop twice. So ultimately you had, I guess, 10 aid stops, 9 or 10 aid stops along the way, or you're supposed to anyway. We'll get to that in a minute. But so I have a running belt, which has a little 12-ounce water bottle in it, a bunch of these supplies. I'm running way behind. I bolt up to the finish line, or the start line, I should say. And literally I had time to tie my shoes and it was off. Like I was running so behind. So that's, not a great start to the day, but I get going, and the first couple miles I realized, like, wow, these trails are no joke, huh? I wonder, this first section of the race is just pretty, like, it was a lot very rocky, very uneven. There was no area to really where you could ever just get going on a good straightaway. I trained a little bit on trails, but I was a runner, really. I didn't, so it ended up being that the vast majority of this 13.1 mile loop was like this. So it was extremely rocky, brutal terrain. You have to be careful not to trip and fall over yourself. I strained my ankle pretty badly, which I thought was a sprain at the time, but luckily it was just a strain at about 7 miles in on the first lap. Like, it was really brutal. So I expected to finish the race in about 5 hours total, which is not a great time for a marathon by any means. But in my head, I was like, if I just finish, I don't care. Well, I got through that first loop and it took 3 hours. So I was way, way, way behind. And I was very discouraged at the end of that first loop. And I was like, I don't know if I didn't know if I could do it. It was so much harder than I thought because of the terrain, which I didn't train particularly well for. So that was really brutal. But I had a ton of people coming. My mom and my sister came in from out of town. I had a bunch of my friends there. My fiance Shay was going to be there. And so I was like, I just have to try to finish. So I started out on my second lap, and I realized that there were very few people that were doing the full marathon. And more than that, one of the people I ran into was a very experienced trail runner, and I ended up passing him up. And so I was like, well, I guess I'm not doing so badly if, these very experienced people are sort of, roughly around the same pace I am. Because again, I wasn't accounting my time for trail race times. It's very different. You have to walk larger chunks of it, and you're kind of like power hiking, I guess you would call it, for a lot of it. And but the second lap was where things got really interesting. So, I had a fair amount of supplies with me, but I also only had a 12-ounce water bottle. That's pretty key. So what happened is the first aid station was about 2 miles in, I think. And then there was supposed to be another one about 3 miles after that. That was there on the first lap around. Well, on the second lap around, for whatever reason, there was some miscommunication, and that aid station was torn down entirely. So that meant there was no water, no snacks, no supplies for that entire stretch. So I ended up going about, I think, 7 or 8 miles of that second lap when I needed it the most, with no aid station whatsoever. And I went about 90 minutes with no water whatsoever. When the sun was finally up, when it was probably the hottest it was going to be throughout the race, it was terrible. There was one poor guy who I saw who was throwing up all over the place because he was so dehydrated, and it ended up being an utter disaster. And that slowed me down even more on that second lap because I was just out of water, out of, energy, dehydrated. Like, it was really brutal. So that really slowed me down. And I really hit a point where I didn't know if I was going to be able to finish, but I also didn't really have much of a choice but to at least get to the next aid station. So time I finally get to that aid station, I got a bunch of water, got a bunch of electrolytes and some snacks, and let them know what had happened. And I for a little bit, I got some juice, and I just started going, and I had this playlist on my MP3 player. I don't run with my phone. I have an old school MP3 player, and I had this playlist of songs that encompassed about an hour's worth that were songs that I really could lock into. So I put that playlist on. I start moving pretty good, but then I kind of hit another wall last few miles. There was another aid station toward the end that I knew was supposed to be there, and I felt like I should have been there. Wasn't there yet. And then finally, because keep in mind, I expected to finish in a 5-hour time. So my friends and family were there waiting. When I had about 2 miles left, I see a couple of really good friends of mine, Adam and Caitlin. They run up the trail to meet me. And I'm like, oh, wow. And they're like, are you okay? Do you want, I'm like, and then I barely even remember what I said to them, but then that gave me the energy to know, not only just seeing them and knowing I was close, but seeing my friends. It was this weird mental boost of energy, and I knew I was close. So then I took off as best I could to the finish line. And so I had about 2 miles left. The second to last mile, I was still struggling badly. But then that last mile, I knew I was close, and I just hit the jets. And luckily it was downhill. And I saw my buddy Brad had come up about a mile up the trail. So I saw him, and I was like, okay, I'm there. And I just start booking it. And I just torched to the finish line. I see my family, my fiance's there, and she ran the last little bit with me. And I just finally crossed the finish line. It took me 6.5 hours. So obviously a lot longer than I planned. And it wasn't even that it was slow. That's another hour and a half you're out in the sun, that you're dehydrated, that you're, going through stores of energy in your body. It was just brutal. Um, and I just remember my first half marathon, which I did about a year and a half ago, maybe a little more. I crossed the finish line and I yelled, fuck yeah, and I just remember like that feeling of just so accomplished and so just like elated. And then when I crossed the finish line this time, I just yelled fuck a few times because I was just so like, it was so draining and so insane and so great. But I just couldn't believe I got through it. And it was so great seeing everybody. And I was in pretty serious pain. My legs were shot. My ankle, as I mentioned, was messed up. And the thing is, my calf strain that I had mentioned earlier, like, I couldn't even tell that was the thing because my entire leg, I mean, I was in so much pain from, hip to toe on each leg that it just didn't matter. And then, so I was so happy that I got it done. But then, cut to a handful of days later, you're kind of recovering. I had what you call runner's toe, which I wasn't really aware was a thing. And pretty much underneath all of my toenails was purple. Luckily, I didn't end up losing my toenails, which happens to a lot of runners, I guess. But yeah, that was kind of it. It was wild. I'm of two minds about it. I'm so happy that I did it, and I felt so accomplished, and I felt it's just something I never thought I was going to do. And I mean, not to be this way about it, but a great deal less than 1% of the population will ever run a marathon. So regardless of the time that I finished it in, I felt a great sense of accomplishment about that, particularly because it wasn't what I trained for. It ended up being very hard. And, I told my fiance as I was getting to the end of this, because the training was so brutal, it's so consuming, it just ate up my life. I said, don't ever let me do this again. And, lo and behold, now I'm like, well, I still kind of want to run a regular marathon where I get to actually run more and not do the trail stuff. So I'm probably going to try to run at least one more and do an actual marathon. But, yeah, I mean, that's it. That's the story. It ended up being, this like beautiful but terrible experience. Like it was, it wasn't at all what I thought it was going to be. It was stressful every step of the way. It was like, I mean, I've not had the easiest life, but it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. And, yeah, but I mean, that's it. That's the story. And, if nothing else, to say that, even though it was harder than I thought it would be, even though I was coming into it under ideal circumstances, I got it done. And, if there's anything to glean from it here, is that, people say this all the time. Runners say this all the time. People that are in much better shape for me on the internet say stuff like this all the time, but it is truly incredible what you can do. And, yeah, that's kind of my takeaway from it. So, thanks for putting up with all my running posts over the last handful of months, and, onward.